I'm here at my home gym with the ER rack. You can see the Alico competition bar behind me. It's great for doing squats, bench press, deadlifts to a competition standard with up to 400 kilos worth of weight. But you know what I like more than just making amazing gains during quarantine and material things is knowledge. In fact, I'm actually more proud of these 9 books from my collection that focus specifically on strength and conditioning, program design, and pain science. It's like Jim Wendler said, it's boring, I agree, but do you want to be entertained or do you want to get big and strong? Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk a little bit about books. Now, I've had a lot of people ask me over the years, and especially lately, I think people have a little bit more time to read maybe, but a lot of people asking me what books and resources they can use to get started if they're interested in getting into coaching, specifically working with powerlifters, or getting into coaching in general. So I'm going to dive into some of the resources I've used over the years, and we'll talk a little bit about them. So this is probably the first big Bible of strength training and conditioning, as it would sort of, one would infer from the title. This is an old edition that I have here. I want to say, yeah, 1994. So probably worth getting a newer edition, but I was a broke-ass student when I got this, and this is a university textbook for me. So this is NSCA's Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, and a lot of studies on a lot of different sort of strategies for strength training. They talk even about how to organize a gym. They talk a lot about different strength training movements, even some plyometrics and things like that, as well as everything from stretching and flexibility and testing, all the way through all kinds of, like I said, conditioning work and things like that. So really good sort of compilation of resources if you're looking to kind of get a base or cursory knowledge about how these things work and how adaptation can be driven in the human body. Now this next one here is going to be a pretty good companion to the previous book, Designing Resistance Training Programs, and this one's going to dive a lot more into periodization, program design specifically. It is probably a little bit outdated. I'm not sure what year this edition is from. It's likely been further updated since then. This is 2004, so not that old. But things that do tend to change in strength and conditioning pretty quickly. So a little bit of sort of basic anatomy and adaptation mechanisms when we're talking about strength and conditioning adaptations in the body. And then a lot of diving into, like I said, periodization models. There are a number of case studies laid out. This is going to be predominantly around the time when the supercompensation model was really popular, and I think we've kind of learned since then that there are some things that are a bit confounding with that model, and there are some other sort of more multi-faceted ways to look at things. We're talking about the adaptation to the human, we're talking about the human body's adaptation to exercise. So it goes over things like detraining, strength loss, which, hey, might be pretty relevant right now. Yeah, I thought it was just a really good idea to get some sort of base layouts for ways that you might structure strength training. So really sort of top-notch pick there as well. So when I started to get interested in powerlifting, this book was an obvious choice. It's called Powerlifting. It's by Dan Austin and Brian Mann. And it's got some really interesting takes on accessory movements, how they might affect the main movement itself, different supplemental, some cues even, some common faults, talking about different grips and stance widths and things like that. So obviously, I think, you know, once you get into the really nuanced sort of aspects of powerlifting programming and technical execution, a book is probably not going to do any justice, but I do think this was a really good baseline when I started taking powerlifting more seriously. I think by the time I got into coaching others, I needed a lot more than what this book had to offer, but when I started working on my own programming and was developing a sort of cursory knowledge of how those strength training principles applied into powerlifting, this was a great resource. So the next few books we're going to talk about have a sort of basis in the interaction between training and injury. So the first one, this was a textbook in my university as well, or when I went to school. This one's called Foundations of Athletic Training. It goes a lot into anatomy, taping and wrapping, things like that. Probably a little bit more specific to if you're gonna be on the sideline coaching or strength coach for a basketball or a football team. So some ways to test for common injuries and things like that. Now, obviously, a lot of this is really heavily rooted in the idea that, okay, if there's pain, there is dysfunction, there is a mechanical cause. And I think over the years, we've kind of gotten away from that, and it's become really popular to move away from that in powerlifting. So there's some interesting things here for sure. At the very least, a cursory knowledge of some of the anatomy that might lead to some of these things in terms of the mechanical causes. Interesting, I don't think I relied on this as heavily as I moved forward as a coach, and we'll talk about why here in a sec. Another big thing, or another sort of aspect of that same sort of idea that, okay, if there's pain, something physically wrong, Stuart McGill. So he's got a bunch of books out there. This was one that I picked up. I actually traded a buddy a book for this and haven't traded back yet, but some really interesting and at the time sort of revolutionary ideas about strengthening the trunk. Now, I do think that there are probably some things there that are worth holding on to, but McGill was also a really big component or proponent, of the, okay, like if it hurts, avoid it at all costs, right? Like you should never go into flexion, even when tying your shoes and things like that. So I think that over the years, we've kind of moved away from some of the avoidance-based advice in here, but in terms of the strength training advice, I think there's some really good stuff in terms of just creating a stronger trunk. I think some of those things could potentially benefit powerlifters. And obviously he's a big proponent of strengthening the back to make it more resistant to injury, which I think is an important takeaway. And despite the fact that, you know, not every ounce of this information is going to necessarily point you in the exact right direction, I think that things like this are a really important sort of baseline or place to get some concepts and ideas to expand upon. So into the next little bit of information here are these two books on pain science. This one's a little bit dusty. So it's called Explain Pain and Why Do I Hurt? Now, Explain Pain, I probably spent a little bit more time with, and it's laid out. There's a lot of interesting images and it's pretty digestible. But the basis of it is it's sort of a treatise or an initiation into the biopsychosocial model of pain. So the idea that the psychology of the person suffering from pain should have some impact, or does have some impact, on how we feel pain. So it talks a lot about how pain happens, the way pain originates, nociceptors and all that kind of fun stuff, and the adaptation of the brain in order to try to mitigate some of those painful things. So this, to me, was a really, really, really good investment, and probably started me along the path that helped me make the most significant steps back from my injury at the time, which I still do deal with to this day, but chronic pain in my hip. Anybody who's followed the channel for any period of time would know. And this was pretty revolutionary, so I definitely heavily recommend this book. And partnered with Why Do I Hurt, I think, is another great book on sort of basic neuroscience when it comes to pain. And again, very, it looks like a pamphlet almost that a doctor would hand out. And the price tag is not reflective of that, unfortunately, but I did think that was a really worthwhile thing to delve into. Now, the next book I'm going to talk about here is a fantastic resource when it comes to sports psychology. This is something that I've heavily relied on, and a lot of the videos that we've made about sports psychology have come from concepts and ideas that have started in this book. It talks about all kinds of things from motivation to competition, cooperation, cohesion, imagery, goal setting, concentration, self-efficacy. Like, all of it is in here. If you have any interest in trying to develop your mental game, and you can get a hold of a copy of this book, I would absolutely 100% recommend it. This book has been fantastic.
Another one of my university textbooks. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about a book called Triphasic Training by Cal Dietz. And Cal Dietz was a strength coach who worked with, I believe, a bunch of varsity teams. And my coach, Mike Tashir, had adopted some of these ideas or practices when there was a really big trend. For anybody who's maybe been following powerlifting for a while, you've seen you saw the trend of all the really long tempo, exaggerated, eccentric lifts that all of Mike's athletes were doing for a while. I talked to Mike a fair bit about it, and some of those concepts and ideas were pulled from this book, and this sort of prevailing training philosophy that came from this was that athletes should spend time working on each of the phases of movement, as per the title, the eccentric, the isometric, and the concentric, in a certain structure and a certain phase, or phasic structure, rather, and try to develop each of the qualities of those specific movements. Now, I do think that Cal Dietz has maybe done some stuff, especially over the last few years. I watched, when Mike recommended this book, I watched some of his lectures, and he's talking about breathing resets and some stuff like that I'm a little bit less taken by, a little bit less interested in, a little bit less easy to swallow information there. But there are, again, some really interesting, like really detailed layouts of some of his programming. And I think you can gain a lot of interesting insight from looking at a coach's programming. And always, even if, 60% of the stuff in here is hokey, and I'm not saying that it is, but even if it were, I still think there's a lot of benefit to taking a look at how other coaches do things in terms of inspiring your own programming, your own coaching decision making, and your own coaching philosophy. So I think this is just an example of the kind of maybe more nuanced books that you can get into when it comes to specific training methods and methodology. Another guy that comes to mind is Dan John. If you can find anything by him, he's a fantastic strength coach, and I highly recommend reading some of his stuff. And there was Squat Every Day by Perryman. Matt Perryman, I want to say his name is. Again, another really good look at, I guess what a lot of people would call sort of the Bulgarian method of really high intensity, really high frequency, high specificity training, and some of the benefits of it. And again, anything like that you're taking from a specific strength coach, you should always be taking with a grain of salt. But I think a really good sort of thing to start exploring after you get the foundations is looking at different coaches and how they adapt the information and what they've learned over the years, because I think it's really valuable. There's a lot of takeaways there. So, all right. That's gonna be it for today. Hopefully everybody found something that they enjoyed or found useful, something they can apply to their own coaching practice. Another great resource I've been using a lot is the RTS Classroom. It's essentially Mike T's Triphasic Training. It's an exploration through all the systems and ideas and concepts that he uses to coach a lot of the powerlifters that he works with, including myself. There's an affiliate link for that in the description box below, so go ahead and check it out if you're interested. It's something I've been doing for years, even before the whole affiliate thing happened. But yeah, definitely recommend checking it out, giving it a look, giving it a listen. And there's just so many great lectures and stuff on the internet, so check around, and perhaps in the future we will talk, or I will talk a little bit more about my own personal training philosophy, go through some program design and some things like that. But all right, enough of me jabbering. We'll see everybody in the next one. Bye.